So I'm on the internet yesterday, which was probably my first mistake, and I'm in a comment thread having a little back and forth with some guy. He seems like a decent sort. It's a perfectly civilized discussion, and after a while I remark, as I often do, on my belief that the national government needs to be drastically downsized and radically disempowered. And the other guy says, "Oh yeah, well, which things would you get rid of?" So I run down the usual list, which you've all probably heard by now. FBI, Bureau of Land Management, Energy Department, Education Department, HHS Department, and so on. Now again, this guy, he didn't appear to be any sort of leftist troll. I think he wasn't, at least, unless he was under some really incredibly deep cover. He had done nothing in the thread up to this point to make me think he wasn't reasonably bright and well informed. But do you know what he said? He said, "Well, okay, I don't disagree with you, but come on, we can't just get rid of the education department. Then there wouldn't be any public schools." And what the hell am I supposed to say to that? And how screwed are we when the ignorance is that bad, even on our own side? You know, the side where they have the facts in their favor, so ignorance need not prevail, since there's nothing to be ignorant about. You only ignore the facts and resort to willful ignorance when the facts are not on your side. At least, that's what I used to think. Now I'm not so sure. So there are people on our side of the political divide who think the Federal Department of Education directly administers and operates everybody's local public schools, such that if you eliminated the cabinet-level agency in Washington, and all the schools nationwide would shut down instantly and indefinitely, which is silly because everybody knows only a Chinese flu virus can do that. Moreover, top-down federal administration of public schools would seem to obviate the need for the existence of, say, state boards of education and even local school districts themselves. But alas, I digress. I'm probably overthinking the problem again. But stuff like this can be incredibly depressing and dispiriting. As it is, we're fighting against a rigged game, an unlevel playing field, so the challenges are numerous enough without people on the right being a bunch of clueless dopes. There is no damn excuse for any citizen of any country not having a functional understanding of how their system of government works and what their own rights are, and especially not when you're choosing to participate in your country's electoral process. If you want to not give a shit about politics and government and never vote, then more power to you. You and I have no quarrel. But if you're an active voter who can't be bothered developing a basic grasp of how the government works that you are choosing people to lead, then you're doing neither yourself nor anybody else any favors. And I guess I should stop before I get into one of my rants about how much I detest high voter turnout. But this isn't the only area right now where folks on the right seem to be intellectually and rhetorically backsliding as of late, but more on that in the main segment. Hit it, Jim Eagle. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where it's easy to remember how the government works, as all plenary authority is vested in the Lord of the Manor. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And you know what I want to talk about even more than anything in the world right now? Freaking COVID. Even as 15 days to slow the spread turns into 22 months, I just never get tired of talking about freaking COVID. But it needs to be talked about at the moment because people on the right are doing it again. They are trafficking in arguments that presume the correctness of leftist paradigms, despite the fact that those paradigms are still just as false as they were back in March of 2020 when we were first forcibly checked into the Hotel COVID-fornia. But hell, at least here in the US, that's still just a funny figure of speech. In Northern Australia, they're actually living it. Calm down, mate. Those aren't biosecurity police state internment camps. They're medical isolation bungalows. Don't you even know the difference? No, mate, I don't know the difference between biosecurity police state internment camps and medical isolation bungalows. But I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, and a dingo ate my baby! Great film if you've never seen it, by the way. Outstanding work by both Meryl Streep and the dingo, I thought. And just so nobody gets alarmed, The baby had its mask on, and the dingo tested negative for COVID, so everybody calmed down. Anyway, returning back to the Northern Hemisphere, people on the right have returned to doing two things that drive me batty, both of which we've talked about before. The first of which is this maniacal obsession with testing people for the stupid flu virus that poses a risk of serious harm to the average person. That is significantly less than 0.1%. And speaking of that, have you seen a picture of Sonia Sotomayor recently? She doesn't go out in public all that much, apparently, and she's been refusing to come into work for some months now because the guy who sits next to her steadfastly refuses to worship at the altar of her hypochondriacal neurosis by wearing a stupid face diaper. And good for you, Justice Gorsuch. If some stupid woman wants to be a ridiculous hypochondriac, that ain't your problem. We won't get out of this nonsense any quicker by pretending these people are anything other than completely barking mad. But anyhow, if you happen to have seen a morbidly obese, wise Latina shuffling around our nation's capital, looking like she can't decide whether to rob a freight train or take a welding class down at the community college, the chances are good it was Justice Sotomayor that you saw. She of the now infamous pronouncement that 100,000 school children are currently in the ICU on ventilators due to the ravages of the Anthony Fauci Memorial Chinese Flu Virus of 2019, brought to you with limited commercial interruptions by communist world domination. But, pro tip for the Justice, if she's watching tonight, and Justice, may I call you Justice? Anyway, here it comes, so listen up. You listening yet? If you ever find yourself heading down to the coffee shop while wearing 3 surgical masks and a gigantic plastic face shield, you might be a crazy person. In fact, I can state with near total certainty that you are, in fact, a crazy person. And even if you were actually gaining some sort of health benefit by wearing all those ridiculous accoutrements about your face and head, would it be worth it? The reason I ask is because look at yourself. 5 years ago, could you have pictured yourself going out in public looking like that? Of course you couldn't have, because nobody plans on taking leave of their sanity ahead of time. So now it falls to your countrymen to tell you, out of an abiding concern for your mental health and your emotional well-being, that it's not freaking normal to venture out in public looking like Latina Darth Vader. And you know what else ain't normal? Mass testing of asymptomatic people for a mild flu virus. I don't know about you, but I'm old enough to remember living in a world where if you thought you were coming down with a respiratory illness, you stayed home and advised other people to keep their distance if they didn't want to catch it. Amazingly, we managed to get through 50,000 years of human civilization, notwithstanding a couple of Black Deaths, using just that same system. Hell, we were already using that system hundreds of years before the advent of the germ theory of disease because people aren't idiots. They can see what's right in front of them. So it wouldn't take them long to figure out that, well, if we don't want to get this thing, we should probably stay the hell away from people who have it. And if you have the option of leaving the city and going to the country, you should do that too. It ain't rocket surgery. It was perfectly within the intellectual grasp of the average resident of 14th century Europe. Are we as smart today as 14th century Europeans were? When it comes to formulating reasonable responses to infectious disease outbreaks, I would submit we probably are not. If you're feeling healthy as a horse, but you're overcome with some compulsive need to stand outside in a line in the cold for 3 hours in close proximity to other people who may be carrying the same virus you're trying to avoid, waiting to have your nose swabbed out so you can find out if you might potentially come down with the sniffles in a few days' time, that is not normal behavior. You might be a crazy person. You know who else is a crazy person? Anybody who can look at a list of all the valid reasons there are for criticizing Joe Biden's performance as president and decide, yeah, COVID test shortage. That's the ticket. That's what I'll attack this guy for. For those fans who are keeping score at home, tomorrow, 12 noon, 20 January, the Joe Biden presidency will hit the 1-year mark. I used to say that he's had the most dismal first year of any elected president, allegedly, in our history, but I think it's safe to say we can remove that second qualifier. This is the absolute worst first year for any president, irrespective of how he assumed the office, and there's a compelling case to be made, in my judgment, for removing the first qualifier as well and saying this guy has just completed the most disastrous 12-month in the history of the presidency. The point being, when there is ample cause for assailing every aspect of this man's performance in office, who in their right mind would skip all the way to the bottom of the list, past all of the important and relevant things, and land on, Joe couldn't give us enough COVID tests? Do you see what I mean about the argument that springs from the acceptance of your opponent's false paradigm? There is no medically indicated reason why we need to be administering COVID tests to all members of the general population. At this point, it seems like we're all just going through the motions in order to prop up this new industry and this new bureaucracy that has grown up around this stupid flu virus. But what have I heard in the past week or 10 days from most or all of the conservative commentators I listen to? Oh, we don't have enough tests. Joe didn't give us enough tests. He wasn't prepared for Omicron. Blah, blah, blah. My God, people just stop it. This is a dangerous president and a dangerous administration right now. We would do really well to keep our eye on the ball right now. The president and his handlers have tried all the tools in their political tool bag for arresting the rate of decline in his still cratering approval numbers, except for one thing. The only arrow they still have remaining in their quiver, which is, of course, to play the wag the dog card and start up a foreign war. All this saber-rattling that just began last week, you think the timing of that is an accident? Do we have any reason to doubt that these people's sense of desperation is sufficiently acute that they would not be burdened with any second thoughts about launching us into a doomed military intervention in some Eastern European border dispute? Because I would submit that we do not. And yet I hear conservative commentator after conservative commentator and legislators too, they're not off the hook, whining about stupid COVID tests. Oh, Joe didn't have enough tests and the case rate's at an all-time high. And you probably know where I'm going next with this. Because we are right back to one of my original pet peeves about the dishonesty of the COVID discourse. Except now it's people on the right who are indulging it. Because it's a lazy, meaningless excuse for criticizing Joe Biden and his bumbling, fumbling, stumbling administration. And so, the imperfect circle is complete. We are right back to square one, falsely referring to every positive test result as a case. We couldn't even retain that one after we had learned it. So now we have to go all the way back to the beginning and explain all over again why it's stupid, misleading, and disingenuous to use the word case in referring to positive test results. And no, it doesn't become any less of those things just because you have flipped the script and you're using the bad argument against the regime instead of them using it against you. It is still a stupid, misleading, disingenuous argument. Do you remember back during the Delta surge when people on the right were saying, how come the government and the media only want to talk about case numbers and not hospitalizations and deaths? It's like they're just trying to mislead and stoke public fear. Which was correct. That's exactly what they were doing, and it's the same thing now that people on the right are doing it. The actual facts are these. COVID-related hospitalization and mortality rates are currently at the lowest level that has been seen since the beginning of the pandemic. The numbers for Omicron are a fraction of what the numbers were for Delta, and those were a fraction of the numbers from the original first wave. In fact, if we're talking about Omicron causing the deaths of otherwise healthy people, meaning people who were likely to be alive 1 year from now and in reasonably good physical shape, that number is so small it is sufficiently tiny as to be statistically indistinguishable from zero. That is why they have to bend over backward to muddy the waters and obscure the distinction between people who die with COVID and people who die of COVID. Which they have been doing all along because the people who run our public health institutions, who are cozy bedfellows with the fake news media establishment, they have had a perverse incentive this whole time to obfuscate the real statistics and to stoke public hysteria because public hysteria is good for business. Right from the beginning, the remit from the top was, damn it, I want bigger death numbers. Give me bigger death numbers. So it'll probably take years or decades to actually parse out what the real numbers are in terms of people who perished prematurely from the with the Kung flu as the primary cause. Needless to say, it'll probably seem way less alarming once you toss out people like guy who got run over by a train and his corpse tested positive for COVID, and lady with congestive heart failure who dropped dead and her corpse tested positive for COVID, and guy who got shot in a drive-by and his corpse tested positive for COVID. And I guess it's remarkable that people are just now starting to talk about that distinction. But the really remarkable thing about it is that it's not commentators on the right who brought it up. It's actually been fake news media performance artists who did that. I guess on the right they've been too busy trying to own Joe Biden with arguments that are predicated on the correctness of various leftist-approved fallacies and falsehoods. And my God, the right is so frustrating sometimes. The facts are nearly always on their side, but they manage to make so little hay out of it so often. And yes, obviously, the deck is stacked in favor of the other side. The playing field slopes like a swimming pool. The goalposts move constantly. The officiating crew, they're all on the take. But doesn't that just make it all the more important to make sure that you're trafficking in arguments that are logically and scientifically sound and which don't piggyback on leftist fallacies and scare tactics? When you fight the engagement on a field of the opponent's choosing under a set of rules that he alone devised, you are always going to lose. Even on the days when you think you've won, that victory will be a Pyrrhic one at best. What possible benefit does the conservative movement have to gain? How does it advance the cause of a Republican victory in the midterm in November if they spend their time blubbering about COVID case rates and Joe not getting everybody enough tests? Yes, Joe Biden has failed spectacularly to deliver on his promise to shut down the virus. But who gives a damn? He's failed on every other single aspect of presidential policy too, and there's a great long list of those failures that are all drastically more important and more consequential than case rates and testing shortages. It does not help our chances of ever checking out of the Hotel COVID-fornia when COVID is the number one thing we continue talking about day after week after month after year. It is time for COVID to be over. A long time ago. So let's maybe start acting like it. If the objective is to damage Joe Biden politically, that's a good and proper objective, but there are much more sensible ways in which to achieve it. And if the objective is to maximize the number of seats the Republicans stand to gain in November, then an obsessive fixation on COVID policy is the absolute wrong way of going about it. This man has wrecked the economy, thrown open the border, pissed away our energy independence, assaulted our civil rights, mocked and belittled our people, destroyed U.S. credibility abroad, and generally conducted himself in office like a less brave, less resolute, less competent version of Jimmy Carter. You could write a 1,000-page book on the failures of Joe Biden's first year in office without even mentioning the stupid Chinese flu virus. So how about let's start acting like it? Because I think we would all regret it quite a great deal if we looked up one day to find ourselves in a shooting war with Russia, which broke out while we were busy complaining about silly COVID nonsense. I forget where it was, but some warmonger was challenging me for a reason why we shouldn't be ready to defend Ukraine's eastern border with every drop of blood and scrap of treasure we have at our disposal. And though I don't usually do this, I answered his question with a question of my own. I said, if we invaded Mexico, do you think Russia would send troops to oppose us? I never did get an answer. And that's it for me tonight. Thanks very much for watching. As always, I will see you Friday. Until then, have a pleasant tomorrow. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.